As Faculty Board Chair in History, I'm delighted to introduce Professor Bruce Schulman, this year's Harold V. Harmsworth Visiting Professor of American History, who's giving this year's Harmsworth Lecture. Professor Schulman is the William E. Huntington Professor of History at Boston University, where he directs the Institute for American Political History. Professor Schulman is the author of a number of books that deal broadly and authoritatively on the relationships between politics and culture in the United States. These include monographs on economic development and the transformation of the South between 1938 and 1980, LBJ and American liberalism, and the seismic shifts that took place in American culture, politics, and society in the 1970s. He's edited numerous books on topics such as the US Constitution and public policy, the relationship between faith and politics in modern America, and the role of mass media in US politics. It's particularly impressive that Professor Schulman has supervised over 30 doctoral students who've gone on to take up faculty posts in a large number of universities and colleges. He's received a number of awards for his services to teaching and curriculum reform. The Harmsworth Professorship was established in 1922 by the first Viscount Rothermere in memory of his son Vivian, who died in the First World War. The professorship is attached to the Rothermere American Institute and also to Queen's College, and the Harmsworth Lecture celebrates its centenary this year. A formal event will commemorate this milestone next summer, and the university looks forward to hosting these lectures for at least another 100 years. Professor Schulman was originally chosen as the Harmsworth Professor in 2020, but the pandemic intervened, and we're fortunate that he's been able to accept the invitation for the current academic year. I now invite Professor Schulman to present a brand new lecture entitled The Forgotten Constitutional Revolution, Amending American Democracy in the Early 20th Century.
Thank you, Professor Iliff, for that generous introduction. I'm reminded of when Lyndon Johnson received a similar encomium. He said that he wished that his parents had been there to hear it because his father would have been proud and his mother, she would have actually believed it. I'd also like to thank my colleagues at the Rothermere American Institute, the Faculty of History, and the Queen's College for the generous welcome you've shown me in my few months here in Oxford. And I want to particularly express my gratitude to Vivian and Alexandra and the entire Harmsworth family for creating and sustaining this grand tradition. I am deeply honored to be here and to mark the centennial of the Harmsworth Visiting Professorship. 100 years ago, in June 1922, Samuel Eliot Morison, a descendant of the earliest British settlers of New England, stood in this very place. So it is perhaps fitting today, a century later, that you have invited another Bostonian to deliver the inaugural lecture. I must say, however, that besides our shared home, I have little in common with that illustrious scion of New England nobility. Morison famously commuted to Harvard on horseback into the 1960s, pasturing his steed on Harvard Yard, and he researched his biography of Christopher Columbus by retracing the mariner's voyages on his private yacht. Still, I do share with my illustrious predecessor the concern he expressed in his inaugural that, in his words, the key to the America of the present lay in the conflict between facts and stubborn beliefs. Like you, Morison told his audience, we are finding clay feet on some of our most revered gods, yet we loathe the idea of setting up new gods. A century later, those words still seem apt. The very bedrock of American democracy seems unstable. The US Supreme Court overturns long-established precedents and seems poised to gut a century of political practice. Extremists threaten violence against the IRS, the federal tax collecting agency. The electoral system itself is under siege. Who votes? How are they represented? What is the scope and scale of government? Who pays for government, and how does it affect the distribution of wealth and power? In one form or another, these questions daily scream from the headlines. They also comprise some of the most fundamental and enduring questions in the history of American democracy. Yet faced with these pressing matters, Americans find themselves in a constitutional straitjacket, notoriously difficult to amend. Comparative studies of written constitutions, like this calculation you see before you, find the US Constitution among the most rigid. So we are, to paraphrase Morrison, finding clay feet on revered practices, but we lack the means to set up new ones. These contemporary concerns, then, raise an important historical question. Scholars have long characterized the Civil War era as a constitutional revolution, what former Harmsworth professor Eric Foner labeled the second founding. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments not only transformed American law and governance by affirming birthright citizenship, abolishing slavery, expanding the franchise, and guaranteeing the equal protection of the laws, they also exerted impact on American jurisprudence, politics, and public life generally, with many far-reaching, often unexpected consequences. But a similarly fertile and frenetic period of constitutional revision and political revitalization in the early decades of the 20th century has received no comparable attention. In American historical scholarship, you will find no references to a third founding. And in fact, a Google search will bring you to a game called Warhammer 40,000. Yet the 19-teens and 20s witnessed a series of fundamental and lasting shifts in the nature of American governance, American electoral politics, the very structure of democracy in the United States. In the process, Americans participated in a broader process of political experimentation that brought written constitutions for the first time to many places, including Russia, Germany, and Persia, reformed many others, and shaped the formation of many new nations in the aftermath of the First World War. This evening, then, I hope to demonstrate that the 1910s and 20s indeed represent a forgotten constitutional revolution, a remarkable period of political experimentation that transformed politics and governance in the United States. I also hope to explain how the American experience participated in a broader transnational phenomenon and the ways it departed from them, to revise some conventional narratives, particularly with regard to the impact of women's suffrage, and to explore, finally, which political forces and intellectual currents enabled so fertile an era of constitutional revision. So let me start by taking stock of the major developments of the era. In 1912, Arizona and New Mexico joined the Union, becoming the 47th and 48th states and claiming the 434th and 435th seats in the House of Representatives. The House was not reapportioned after the 1920 census. We'll get to why soon. And in 1929, Congress fixed the House's size at 435. So although disputes over so-called gerrymandering may trace back to the Massachusetts Federalist whose name adorns the practice, the federal Congress had added members nearly every decade for a century, so that reapportionment had always involved the allocation of more seats rather than a redistribution of them. After 1912, it became a zero-sum game. Second, also in 1912, former President Theodore Roosevelt came out of retirement to challenge his handpicked successor, William Howard Taft, for the Republican presidential nomination. In an ultimately futile effort to wrest control of the nomination process from party bosses who favored Taft, Roosevelt pinned his hopes on a new practice that a handful of states had recently introduced: primary elections, in which the rank and file would choose the party's candidates for office rather than leaders in closed caucuses. Roosevelt's campaign successfully lobbied several state parties to initiate primary elections. He won 9 of the 12 contests in that year in that first ever presidential primary campaign. Championing program and personality over party, TR also consciously deployed newly emerging mass media, especially large circulation national magazines and film. So you see him here in a Path newsreel that he carefully stage managed. In fact, when the crew arrived at Roosevelt's Long Island estate, they found him and they wanted to film him in his tennis whites. But he would have none of that, insisting on the images of manly energy you see here, the horseback, the dogs, and so on. Now, while it would take half a century before primaries became the decisive factor in candidate selection, Roosevelt's campaign pioneered what would become a distinctive feature of American national politics: the later nomination of candidates opposed by their party leaders. From Barry Goldwater and George McGovern to Barack Obama and Donald Trump would be inconceivable without this innovation. Well, a year later, in 1913, and now we get to concrete constitutional change, the states ratified both the 16th and 17th Amendments. The latter, providing for the direct election of U.S. senators, culminated a 25-year effort during which the House of Representatives repeatedly passed resolutions to have voters, rather than state legislatures, choose members of the upper house, but the Senate refused to even consider the measure. Now, what prompted this effort? Already by the 1890s, the Senate had developed a reputation as an unrepresentative, unresponsive guardian of elite interests, highly partisan and deeply corrupt. Senators won and retained their seats by heeding the wishes of those who controlled the state legislatures that selected them, party leaders and corporate interests rather than constituents. So this cartoon, for example, depicts Republican Senator Nelson Aldrich as the tool of bosses and bloated interests who are pressing down upon the people. Meanwhile, scattered revelations of bribes paid to state legislatures to influence their senatorial choices convinced many that such backroom deals were common. To be a senator, one newspaper reported in 1897, to be a senator is to be a suspect. Also, frequent deadlocks over the choice of a senator further intensified the pressure for reform. Between 1890 and 1905, in no fewer than 45 instances in 20 different states, legislatures delayed filling seats because they could not agree on appointments. 14 seats remained vacant for at least one entire congressional session. Delaware, the worst offender, put only one of its 2 allotted senators in place for 6 consecutive years, and none at all for 3 of those. So beginning in 1892, the upstart People's Party platform regularly demanded direct election of senators. Starting in 1900, the Democratic Party did likewise. The Socialist Party went even further. Milwaukee's socialist Congressman Victor Berger proposed the total elimination of the U.S. Senate. Starting in 1893, the House several times approved direct election of senators by far more than the required 2/3 margin for a constitutional amendment. By the turn of the century, several state legislatures explicitly endorsed the measure. The Senate, already known as the graveyard for reform hopes, just ignored them. In response, a committee of the Pennsylvania legislature developed an ingenious workaround. Article 5 of the Constitution offers two pathways for revision: the arduous amendment process requiring 2/3 approval of both houses of Congress and ratification by 3/4 of the states, and the prospect of calling a new constitutional convention that could revise and even replace the entire document. That required petitions from 2/3 of the states. Pennsylvania did so, and it sent copies of its convention petition to every other state, encouraging them to follow suit. Soon a dozen states joined. Others, worried that a convention might go beyond restructuring the Senate, followed the examples of Georgia and Arkansas in most respectfully requesting Congress to propose a direct election amendment. 31 state legislatures, so that's only one less than the required 2/3, took one or the other of those actions. The turning point came in the 1910 midterm elections. That was the campaign that broadly introduced the term progressive into American politics and led to a rout of conservative old guard Republicans. 10 senators who had long opposed direct election met defeat in 1910. Their replacements, mainly a cohort of progressives, pressed forward. When the new Congress convened, it approved the amendment, and the states ratified it swiftly in April of 1913. Now, a few months before, the 16th, the income tax amendment, became part of the Constitution. And even though its immediate impact proved less obvious than direct election of senators, because very few Americans would be subject to the levy for several decades, it would have more profound, far-reaching consequences than any other constitutional revision of the 20th century. Now, Americans had first experimented with income taxes during the Civil War. That first tax established a high threshold, exempting all but the richest 1% of the population. In 1872, amid strident opposition from wealthy constituents, Congress allowed it to lapse. Over the next generation, 3 separate impulses renewed the push for income taxes. First, the long-standing struggle centered in the Democratic Party against the protective tariff and the industrial state Republicans that championed it. Custom duties constituted far and away the national government's largest source of revenue, so cutting the tariff necessitated an alternative funding stream like the income tax. Second, reformers, including the young Theodore Roosevelt, intent on professionalizing government and eliminating corruption, saw income tax revenue as a means to create a well-trained, well-paid, public-spirited civil service. Crucial to that effort was replacing fee-for-service models of compensation for federal officials, such as them getting payment for issuing permits or collecting bounties on the illegal goods they seized, replacing those models with salaried employees. Third and finally, a diverse crew of labor and agrarian radicals embraced progressive taxation as a weapon against the concentration of wealth and power in the United States. With a new Democratic majority, including several populist fusion members, Congress enacted a new income tax in 1894. Within a year, however, it would not only be scotched, but seemingly banned from all future consideration. In a contentious and largely incoherent decision, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled the tax unconstitutional. Democrats and populists immediately called for a constitutional amendment, but Republicans did not share their enthusiasm, and when they swept back into the majority in the next election, they saw no need to act. Gradually, though, public support began to develop. 2 Republican presidents, Roosevelt and Taft, publicly endorsed an income tax. They saw it as a tool to modernize the tax system and the nation. Roosevelt, for example, noted that, in his words, an income tax could be found among most great civilized countries. But they also saw it as essential to social stability, as a way to deflect proposals for more radical redistributive measures. Supporters of the income tax then pursued two tracks: a constitutional amendment or simply passing a new tax law in the hope that new personnel on the High Court would overturn the previous ruling. That strategy possessed the advantages of requiring only a simple rather than a two-thirds majority and immediate implementation without waiting for ratification by the states. Well, in one of those odd quirks of political history, the amendment strategy prevailed because the tax's old guard Republican opponents, understanding they lacked the votes to derail all versions, pushed through the amendment in the hope that the states would refuse to ratify it. Initially, Senator Nelson Aldrich of Rhode Island, chair of the Senate Finance Committee, famous for bottling up reform proposals. Here you see a cartoon depicting him as a spider trapping all legislation. Aldrich thought he could push through a new tariff without any new taxes. When he realized he could only keep the income tax out of the tariff bill if he deflected support onto the amendment, he came out in favor of that strategy, which he thought would never make it through the states. Though ultimately unsuccessful, it was not a bad strategy. The ratification process proved contentious and took 4 years. Once in place, however, the income tax transformed the fiscal basis of American governance, initiating what would become the permanent national taxation of income. The 1913 Tax Act, even though it imposed modest rates and exempted almost 98% of all households whose income fell below the minimum threshold, it became almost overnight the main source of revenue for the federal government. So as you can see from this chart, in 1910, customs duties accounted for nearly half of all federal government receipts, with alcohol and tobacco taxes another 39%. A decade later, the income tax furnished the majority of federal revenue. Now, a similar, if slightly less dramatic shift occurred at the state level as progressive levies on incomes, inheritances, and corporations supplanted the total reliance on property and excise taxes as the revenue sources for state governments. So think about the implications of this fiscal revolution. It reallocated across economic classes and geographic regions the economic responsibility of financing government, imposing a greater share of burden on wealthy individuals and on corporations in the Northeast. In so doing, it at least partly fulfilled the aspirations of tax advocates like Plain Bill Sulzer of New York, who wanted to shift the tax burden from honest toil to idle wealth. I quote Sulzer here because I love his story. He began his career as a Tammany Hall machine politician, but then when he got into the governor's office in Albany, New York, he became a reformer. The machine didn't like that. They had records of all his untoward activity as a machine politician, leaked those, and he was the first governor of New York to be impeached and removed from that office, and the only one until Andrew Cuomo recently followed him. Well, the 16th Amendment also facilitated fundamental changes in the size, scope, and purposes of government, at once funding a wide range of public goods and services and the ongoing public regulatory agencies to oversee them. And at the same time, it required the development of administrative capacity to track income, profits, and inheritances, which meant gathering a lot more information about people's economic lives. So to give you an idea, between 1917 and 1920, the staff of the Bureau of Internal Revenue quadrupled. So the fixing of the House of Representatives, presidential primaries, direct election of senators, the income tax. Next, in January 1919, came the ratification of the 18th Amendment, the prohibition of alcohol, which had been sent to the states 13 months earlier. Prohibition in many ways advanced the political revolution that the income tax had underwritten, the transformation in the size and scope of the federal government and its intensifying presence in the lives of ordinary citizens. In fact, Prohibition affected the relationship between state and society more than it actually banned alcohol, for by the time the 18th Amendment was ratified, much of the US was already dry. But prohibition did make a difference. With few exceptions, most prominently conscription during wartime, public land sales, and regular interactions with the post office, 19th century Americans had little felt the direct hand of the federal government in their daily lives. Chances were that the postmaster was the only federal official you ever saw. Prohibition insinuated federal authority into production, distribution, and consumption, affecting the livelihoods of many and the leisure practices of many more. Enforcement of the 18th Amendment, historians have shown, transformed the law of search and seizure, grew the federal police presence, and laid the foundations for the contemporary carceral state. Prohibition, the crime it sparked, and the unequal impact of enforcement, one scholar has recently concluded, permanently convinced Americans to look to the federal government for solutions to national problems. But there's another side to this story. For even if prohibition did advance the state-building process, expanding both the knowledge available to and the authority of federal officials, it also showcased a distinctive feature of U.S. statecraft. With relatively few prohibition agents operating around the country, the federal government had broad powers, but much less capacity. So it had to rely on local authorities and on private actors like the American Legion, the veterans organization. So here you see some federal prohibition agents, the legendary pair of undercover agents, both in disguise and not, but also the role of the American Legion and private entities in prohibition enforcement. Now, most of you in this audience will know that that was hardly novel. Federalism and public-private partnerships have been a long-standing feature of American statecraft. But the model of prohibition, far-reaching national involvement in the day-to-day lives of ordinary citizens, implemented by local governments or in partnership with private actors with dramatically varying impact on different regions and populations, that model would persist into the 21st century. It extends from the welfare provisions of the Social Security Act, which allowed states to determine their own benefit levels and eligibility requirements, right through to Obamacare. Prohibition, of course, dramatized a broader kind of cultural conflict as well in the early decades of the 20th century. Deep distrust between the rapidly growing, increasingly diverse cities and the shrinking small towns of the South and Midwest. The 1920 census had highlighted those tensions. For the first time, a majority of Americans lived in urban areas, a landmark that reflected both mass immigration from abroad and internal migration from the countryside. Between 1910 and 1920, the urban population grew by 19 million people, while rural areas actually shrank by 5 million. Those shifts underlay a bitter debate about representation. You see, since the founding, Congress had handled reapportionment after each decennial census simply by adding members. They added enough seats to make sure that no state would lose a House member. They could only gain seats or, at worst, hold steady. But the huge early 20th century swings in population meant that in order to avoid taking seats away from any state, the House would have had to swell from 435 to 483 seats. Almost everyone thought that was a bad idea. The House functions badly enough at its current size, the New Republic magazine insisted, and hardly needs more members adding to the legislative babble. But if the House remained at 435, a dozen states would lose seats, and power would shift from the South and Midwest to the urban Northeast, a shift that would also threaten Republican control of Congress. And with New Mexico and Arizona having filled in the map of the continental United States, Republicans could not rely on the strategy of adding new states to bolster their power, a strategy that had served them well in the past, most notably with the admission of Dakota Territory as not one but two states in 1889. So after 1920, the Republican majority, aided by a handful of Southern Democrats, stonewalled. They bottled up reapportionment for 6 years, and eventually representatives from the growing states just gave up. Instead, they decided to seek a permanent formula in advance of the 1930 census. The ensuing law, the Reapportionment and Census Act of 1929, fixed the House at 435. But at the same time, it dropped the provision of earlier laws that required states to form districts of contiguous and compact territory that contained a nearly equal number of persons. Deleting that provision led to districts of vastly unequal numbers of peoples. So, for example, in Kentucky, the legislature squeezed all 355,000 residents of Jefferson County, which includes Louisville, the state's largest city, into one district while creating several rural seats that had only about half as many people in them. And of course, that practice would spark half a century of litigation. If you're as outraged by the story as I am, here's a t-shirt you can order from Amazon. Well, if the fixing of the House and the 16th, 17th, and 18th Amendments established the structures of 20th century governance, women's suffrage transformed the spheres of political mobilization and electoral competition. Now, historians have generally analyzed the 19th Amendment, ratified in 1920, as an ending, seeing it as the culmination of a long campaign to achieve the suffrage. Conventional accounts rarely treat the amendment as a beginning. Indeed, the standard narratives note that for decades after 1920, women turned out at a lower rate than men, and they suggest that women basically voted like their husbands and fathers, so that suffrage little altered the structure and content of national politics. In 1924, the veteran political reporter Charles Edward Russell declared women's suffrage a failure. Nothing has been changed, Russell concluded, except that the number of docile ballot droppers has approximately been doubled. Now, while somewhat less snide, scholarly accounts still largely jibe with Russell. For example, in her overview of the 1920s, historian Lynn Dumenel accepts that, I quote, "Women accomplished little with their votes, and the women's movement itself was in the doldrums after the ratification of the 19th Amendment." So prevalent is this view that the National Women's History Museum is still touting it on its website. That turns out to be misleading, if not just plain wrong. Suffrage, economists and sociologists have demonstrated, affected legislative behavior and changed policy outcomes. It catalyzed significant increases in social and educational expenditures, expanded the scope and reach of public health campaigns, and produced substantial improvements in child welfare. Now, because many states adopted suffrage before the federal amendment, you can track state expenditures on public health and child mortality rates, and in every case, expenditures on child health increase within 2 years of women getting the vote, and soon thereafter, child mortality drops. On the national level, dramatic examples of this policy impact included congressional passage of laws funding pre- and postnatal care for infants, outlawing adulterated milk, providing independent citizenship for married women, and a constitutional amendment banning child labor, although the states never ratified that last measure. But, and this is where I want to develop the argument further, suffrage also changed the conduct of politics, leading Americans from the smoke-filled room to, well, the singing teapot. Yes, the singing teapot. Escorted by a marching band and growling motorcycles in 1924, the newly formed Women's Division of the Democratic National Committee launched the Singing Teapot on a tour of more than 100 northeastern cities and towns. The 7-passenger vehicle, wrapped in canvas and adorned with a papier-mâché teapot, reminded voters of the Teapot Dome scandals that enveloped the sitting Republican administration. The Singing Teapot will boil with Republican corruption, the Women's Division chairwoman told the New York Times. At every stop on the tour, women passed out campaign literature and pasteboard teapots, like you saw here. And when the lid blew off the Singing Teapot, a Democratic speaker would pop out and start talking. So you see, millions of women voters not only enlarged the electorate, but also catalyzed changes in the structure and style of national politics. Now, to be sure, the Democrats decided to form their women's division in 1922 because the ratification of the 19th Amendment seemed to have benefited the rival Republicans. But it also reflected the recognition that women voters generally lacked the fierce partisan attachments that had long characterized the political lives of American men. Party politics had been a quintessentially male enterprise. To be a man, one historian of the suffrage movement noted, you had to have a party. Saloons, streets, clubhouses, traditionally male spaces define the terrain of party politics. Male critics of partisan excess risk charges of being unmanly, mollycoddles. One Kansas senator likened unaffiliated voters to a third sex. In his words, unable either to beget or to bear, doomed to sterility, isolation, and extinction. But womanliness, on the other hand, demanded hostility to partisanship. Not only had women been excluded from traditional party politics, they had created an alternate political universe of nonpartisan interest groups and voluntary associations. Yes, a handful of women had ventured into partisan politics to secure the suffrage, and a few even agitated for women to abandon their historic antipathy to party, but that impulse won very few adherents. When the Democratic National Committee's newly created Women's Division strategized about attracting women voters, it explicitly rejected party building. The manual it created for women campaign workers warned that newly enfranchised women remained reluctant party members. Instead, activists should concentrate on gaining votes for the ticket because a stress on party would frighten away female voters. So they saw women voters, as you can see from this excerpt from the manual, as unwilling to tie themselves to the narrowness of one political party. So yes, they wanted to enroll more Democrats, but that was a task for another time. Now, although disappointed by the eventual defeat of their ticket in 1924, the Democrats' Women's Division nonetheless hailed women's electoral achievements. Unbossed, unterrified, taking their own measure of each candidate presented, picking fastidiously among the lot of them, they reported about the behavior of women voters in that campaign. Newly enfranchised women differed from male partisans, they concluded, in, I quote, weighing qualities here and balancing deficits and handicaps there. Well, that was the Democrats. The rival Republicans soon reached a similar conclusion. In 1928, Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover won the presidency. Early on, Hoover, who had made his reputation as an engineer, policy wonk, and leader of international relief efforts, rather than as a partisan politician, set up a dedicated campaign operation to monitor the preferences and recruit votes from women, which his campaign expected to be favorable toward Hoover's technocratic approach. Sadly, they compiled no hard data, but after the election, they surveyed every local Republican committee person, and they confirmed the crucial role of women voters in Hoover's election. The aftermath of suffrage, then, marked a crucial milepost in the decades-long transformation from the largely face-to-face politics of parties that had dominated 19th century American elections to the mass-mediated politics of interests that emerged in force by the middle of the 20th century. The central problem of modern American political history, I think it's still fair to say, remains the path from the era of the machine to the era of the media consultant. How and why did Americans navigate this shift from a time when parties structured political, social, and even cultural life, and local party organizations formed the principal intermediaries between politicians and ordinary citizens, to an era when politicians communicated with and mobilized voters primarily through mass media and organized interest groups, which fractured the electorate along multiple axes besides partisan ones. Now, of course, no one single factor propelled this decades-long transformation. It reflected demographic change, especially the huge influx of immigrants that forced parties to recruit outside their natural bases. At the same time, new technologies created alternate vehicles for political communication between politicians and ordinary citizens. They also narrowed the appeal of party affiliation. In the last part of the 19th century, politics had functioned as a form of mass entertainment as well as a tool of governance. The emergence of competition, films, recorded music, radio, further damaged parties by uncoupling entertainment from politics. Still, I want to argue that suffrage was crucially important to the emergence of modern American political practice. The enfranchisement of women voters and the empowerment of a large constituency of women involved in reform activities who had been hostile to party politics accelerated many long-term shifts in the structures of American politics. Suffrage, that is, advanced trends that had long been associated with women's political activities, an emphasis on advertising and campaigns of education, the linkage of party to corruption, a reliance on interest groups to mobilize voters. An expanded electorate, including millions of newly enfranchised women, altered the rules of American electoral competition. So then, the early 20th century marked a genuine constitutional revolution. Through both formal amendment and new political practices, early 20th century Americans transformed both governance and electoral politics. And they were not alone. Americans rewrote the rule book of national life at the very same moment that peoples and nations around the globe experimented with constitutional revision. The late 19th and early 20th centuries formed a period of profound, expansive constitutional activity, what the historian Linda Colley describes in her recent study of comparative constitutionalism as the era of breakout. Nations on every continent except Antarctica adopted written constitutions for the first time. Others, like the United States, made major changes to their fundamental political orders. Now, many of these new constitutions drew heavily on the experience of liberal regimes such as France, Switzerland, and the United States, often borrowing whole sections nearly verbatim. Some openly acknowledged these debts. Czechoslovak nationalists after World War I hailed the, quote, American principles that underlay their new democratic republic. In most cases, however, turn-of-the-century experiments with written constitutions went beyond such liberal specifications of rights and powers. They attempted, as one contemporary expert explained, not just to subject authoritarians to the rule of law, but to subordinate politics to law, mandating not just the process for lawmaking, but the content of statutes. Advancing ideals of social justice and working class empowerment, these new constitutions expanded their guarantees of rights from political and civil liberties to areas of health, welfare, labor, and social security, spelling out the goals of public policy in explicit constitutional provisions. The German Weimar Constitution of 1919 represented perhaps the most dramatic example of this global tendency. It established state control over education, a comprehensive system of social insurance, and in Article 165, the right of labor to cooperate on equal terms with employers, both in the regulation of wages and working conditions and in the direction of industry. In addition, expansion of the franchise, especially women's suffrage, also figured largely in this era of constitutional breakout in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Well, the United States was not immune from this trend. Many Western state constitutions, written and ratified in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, included social provisions, requirements for an 8-hour workday, bans on child labor, restrictions on the concentration of land ownership, protection of public water rights. Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, and Idaho also enfranchised women. Even if we consider not states but the nation as a whole, some observers saw a similar migration from a liberal to a more social democratic political order in the early 20th century. Prominent among them was none other than Samuel Eliot Morison, the inaugural Harmsworth professor. 20 years ago, he reflected in 1922, 20 years ago, it seemed that the nation's genius for political experiment had played itself out, that America had settled into smug satisfaction with things as they were. But, he told his Oxford audience, in the last 20 years, we have introduced women's suffrage and direct popular legislation, the initiative and referendum. Even more important, Morison concluded, Americans had, in his words, abandoned laissez-faire for government regulation, which he described as a fundamental change that, again his words, like the American Revolution, had renewed American political institutions without social overturn. Morrison's Harvard colleague, the future Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter, concurred, even though Frankfurter agreed with Morison on very little else. Beyond the traditional functions of police and justice, Frankfurter identified a new relationship of the public and its government, structured around, his words, new tasks of government, the demands citizens make upon the government, and the instruments by which those demands are executed. Well, from our vantage point, a century later, we can perhaps understand some of Frankfurter's and Morrison's enthusiasm, even if the social democratic transformations they hailed seem to us, even today, painfully incomplete. Women's suffrage and primary elections laid the foundations for modern electoral politics, dealing death blows to the 19th century system of partisan conflict, even if that corpse would bleed out very slowly. The 17th Amendment and the fixing of the House of Representatives gave the federal Congress its enduring modern shape, and the 16th Amendment made possible modern American statecraft. Almost none of the expansion of federal power in the second half of the 20th century would be imaginable without the fiscal basis the income tax supplied. At the same time, early 20th century Americans pioneered new activist forms of law and administration that moved the constitutional order toward the modern conception of a public service state and expanded the notion of the police power to justify that enlarged social role, even if the US Supreme Court would not get fully on board with that shift until the late 1930s, and seems ready to jump off that ship in the 2020s. Well, what conclusions then might we draw from this remarkable period? Let me suggest three. First, substantive constitutional change in the rigid U.S. system required explicit, coherent, politically mobilized opposition to the established order. In the early 20th century, numerous writers, theorists, and intellectuals punctured the aura surrounding the founding and openly denounced the U.S. Constitution as undemocratic, even reactionary. Charles Beard's takedown of the founders remains the most famous of these works, even if the Kalamazoo, Michigan newspaper didn't quite get his argument right. But there were dozens of such works, many of them, like J. Allen Smith's The Spirit of American Government, popular and influential. Members of Congress, for example, cited these works during debate on amendments, stressing that the founders had been, in the words of one Minnesota senator, nothing but fallible men. These critiques were taken up by numerous social movements and political parties, including the Populists, the Socialists, and the Bull Moose Progressive Party. Theodore Roosevelt himself came out for overturning judicial rulings by plebiscite, a position that caused his old friends in the American establishment to think he had lost his mind. My point here is that radical challenges to the constitutional order made incremental change by amendment both more feasible and more necessary. The 16th Amendment explicitly rebuked the courts. The 17th Amendment may itself have made little difference, but the battle for it exposed the possibility of wholesale political change through a new constitutional convention. Second, while Americans did experiment with the contemporaneous global trend towards substantive social democratic constitutionalism, they never fully embraced it. The failure of the Child Labor Amendment testified to the limits of this tendency. The American Bar Association, for example, touted its support for child labor legislation, but opposed the Child Labor Amendment, which it found alien to the liberal principles of the U.S. Constitution. Third, and finally, voting rights do matter. Despite the prevailing interpretation of suffrage as a hollow reform, the enfranchisement of women voters materially affected policy outcomes and transformed the practice of electoral politics in the United States. Taken together, then, the constitutional and legal innovations of the early 20th century transformed the structure and content of American public life. They may not have amounted to a third founding, but without the violence of the Civil War or the American Revolution, they redrew the playing field of American politics. To a large extent, for better and for worse, Americans still play by the rules they forged. Well, taking stock of this hidden constitutional revolution in the early 1920s, the jurist Edward Corwin drew this sadly forgotten lesson, one I wish contemporary Americans might take to heart. That includes you, Justice Alito, if you ever watch this video. As a document, the Constitution comes from its framers, Corwin explained. As a law, it derives its force and effect from the present generation of American citizens and should therefore be interpreted in light of present conditions and with a view to meeting present problems. Thank you.